Would we rather live on Mars or the Moon? Mars seems to be the more popular choice for most people, but what would it actually be like to live on the Moon? First, let's talk about housing. How can we make homes on the Moon? As of right now, the only structures on the Moon are the ones that were left behind by the Apollo missions. These structures are called the moon bases, and there are 3 of them. There's an airlock, which is where astronauts would enter and exit the lunar surface through. There's the module, which is where astronauts would sleep and eat and do experiments. And finally, there's the equipment locker, which is where they kept all of their gear. Now, these structures aren't exactly livable for long periods of time. They weren't meant to be. The longest anyone has stayed on the Moon was 75 hours or 3 days. That was for the last mission in 1972, so they really don't have enough supplies or food to keep people alive for much longer than that. But because of this, we have a lot of knowledge about how to build a house on the Moon. These moon bases can withstand meteorites and radiation from the sun. This means any future houses would probably look similar to these. NASA themselves have plans for a moon base, and their plan consists of 3D printing a whole bunch of structures. With the use of robots, we can 3D print entire buildings using regolith. Regolith is just the fancy name for the dust and rocks on the Moon's surface. This would require very little resources to produce tons of building materials. Another idea for houses on the Moon is inflatable modules. This was actually proposed by O'Neill in 1976. These would essentially be giant balloons that are filled with air and pressurized so that they can be used as a living space. They'd probably be built similarly to an airship. The airship has a giant balloon that's filled with helium, which makes it float. And then there's a basket underneath that's where people ride in. Instead of helium, though, the moon base would be filled with nitrogen. On Earth, we mostly breathe in oxygen, but it's actually mostly made up of nitrogen. We just can't use it for breathing. So, it'd actually be pretty easy to get our hands on a lot of nitrogen. The benefit of these inflatable modules is that they could be launched in a rocket. You might think a rocket wouldn't be big enough to fit a house inside of it, but remember that the objects would be deflated until they reached the Moon. Once they got there, the modules could simply be inflated and voila, house. Of course, we can't forget about windows. Windows would be crucial to any moon-based design. After all, who wants to live in a cave? No one. We need to be able to see outside. The only problem is, what would those windows be made out of? It can't be glass. If a rock hit it, it would shatter. So, instead, they would likely be made out of metal. In fact, they might look similar to portholes in submarines. Those things can withstand incredible amounts of pressure. And if a meteorite hit it, you might be able to repair it. Whereas if a meteorite hit a window made out of glass, it would just break. Of course, metal windows would block our view, but we could always put a camera up there to see out. One disadvantage of metal windows is that they could reflect heat. They could also trap heat inside of the structure. If there's no way to cool down the structure, it could become a sauna. And finally, the walls would need to be very thick. On Earth, we're rarely worrying about meteorites hitting our houses. On the Moon, however, they would happen a lot more frequently. A meteorite happens somewhere on Earth every 2 years, but on the Moon, it happens every 5 days. In order to protect us from these meteorites, the walls would need to be at least 1.5 meters thick. To give some perspective, the walls in my house are less than half a meter thick, and I do end have to worrying about getting bombed by space rocks. Now that we know what our house would look like, let's go ahead and talk about food. What would we eat? During the Apollo missions, astronauts ate freeze-dried foods. These included fruits and vegetables and meat. All of these had been dried out so that they take up less space and weight. When they were ready to eat, the astronauts would simply pour hot water into the packet and wait for it to rehydrate. This would result in something that looks closer to the original form of the food. It wasn't ideal, but it got the job done. However, if we really wanted to live on the moon, we couldn't rely on freeze-dried foods. Not only does it not sound very delicious, but the journey to the moon takes for days. If you want to bring enough food for a 4-day trip, you'd need to bring enough food for 4 weeks. It's just unreasonable to bring that much food for such a long period of time. The solution would be to grow our own food. However, on the moon, there's no soil. Soil is what plants normally grow on. Without it, we wouldn't be able to grow anything. Luckily, we can make soil. NASA already has a plan for this. They have developed a special recipe that uses the regolith found on the moon, human waste, and other chemicals. This creates a mixture that can be used for plants to grow on. So, theoretically, we could create farms on the moon. There would be one major problem, though: light. Plants need light in order to survive. This isn't a problem on Earth since we have tons of sunlight. On the moon, though, we don't. The moon receives 1/6 the amount of light from the sun that Earth does. In fact, during one lunar day, which is equivalent to 146 hours, there's only 6 hours of daylight. This means our plants would only receive 1/4 the amount of light they should. We could always just add lights, though. With the use of LEDs, we can mimic the wavelength of light that plants need. This means we could technically create plant farms and grow our own food on the moon. The biggest problem would be making sure they have enough water. Water is essential for plants to grow, and currently there's no water on the moon. There are theories that there could be water ice hidden on the moon, but it hasn't been discovered yet. So, for now, we'll just assume there's no water. Without water, the plants would dry out and die. So, we'd either need to bring water or find a way to recycle our own. Recycling our own water would be possible if we have enough technology. Currently, NASA is working on a device that can turn urine into drinking water. It sounds gross, but it would be a great way to save water, and it would definitely come in handy on the moon. The final thing we need to cover is transportation. How would we get around? If we ever want to visit the moon, we'd need to wear a spacesuit. Spacesuits allow us to breathe and keep us safe from the environment. However, they're very heavy and it's difficult to move around in them. This means that walking would be an option, but it would be slow going. The other option would be rovers. Rovers have been used on Mars before, and they've proven to be very helpful. However, they're expensive to send to other planets. We could always develop better rovers that are lighter and faster. One idea would be to create rovers that move sideways. This would allow us to traverse over large rocks and craters. Another idea is to create magnetic wheels that can attach to the lunar surface. This would allow us to drive across low-gravity areas. Self-driving cars are becoming very popular on Earth, and they're relatively safe. On the moon, though, they would be much safer. The reason for this is because there's no traffic laws. You can just drive however you want. Also, there's no cops. I mean, who's gonna stop you? We could also create underground tunnels. This would be very beneficial during the night when temperatures drop to negative 180 degrees Celsius. Tunnels would allow us to travel safely between locations. So, would we rather live on Mars or the moon? Well, the moon is probably more realistic. We already have a lot of knowledge about how to survive on the moon, whereas on Mars, we really don't know what to do. However, the moon doesn't have any gravity and Mars does. Gravity is important because without it, our bones become weak. If we want to live on the moon, we'd either need to simulate gravity or find a way to make ourselves stronger. Living on the moon would be a challenge, but it would also be an adventure.